And so how, obviously the interest as a child gets sparked by sort of the fantastic of space, but that clearly has to evolve through high school, undergrad, grad school, postdoc, professorship, and even then I'm sure that the reasons why you stay interested in the field keep on evolving. So what first you got interested in the field as a young boy, and then how did that evolve, and how did that keep going?
Yeah. So I tried to think about when I first wanted to be a scientist, and when that was exciting to me. I think it was reading a lot of books at home and looking at things. My dad had a telescope, and we would go out in the backyard sometimes and look at the moon, and I'd see it. And, okay, yeah, that's nice. I actually liked much more reading a book about the moon. Definitely. And seeing, because the pictures in there were better than what I saw through the telescope, and far more informative with all the extra words around it. So I guess I was a book lover starting from an early age in terms of how I like to learn. Somewhere like in 6th grade or something, one of my teachers asked everybody, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And was writing everything on the board, and I remember answering scientist at that time. So even back that early, and then he scared me because he then listed what it would take in terms of schooling and like startup costs to be that type of a position. And so, yeah, you want to be a scientist? Oh yeah, you're looking at a decade of school past high school, and you're looking at $1 million to start up your lab or something. You had to do it from scratch, or even more, to buy all this equipment.
Yeah. But even like growing up during like the Apollo era and going to the moon, like they didn't like want to advertise being a scientist in that time period, or was it more like frowned upon?
So when I grew up, I was born in '70, so I was kind of before. The Apollo era was before me, but I grew up in the space shuttle time period. Okay. So yeah, when I was in that formative years of late elementary through high school, of trying to pick a career path and where you want to go, that was the time when space shuttles were doing their first flights, and distinctly remember that first flight of the test flight of Enterprise, just sort of going up off the back of a 747 and landing. And, ooh, yeah, this is that's a neat thing.
Speaking of the space shuttle, what did you think of it as it was coming out, and then more as your career progressed? Because you had all the excitement in the late 50s, early 60s to late 60s of, oh, we sent a man to the moon. Oh, we sent a dog to space, and then 10 years later, there's a man standing on the moon. And then
eventually you're just going to, not the moon, 250,000 miles away. Now all of a sudden you're going to low Earth orbit, and you're staying there.
And then the space shuttle has a fairly boring routine thing. How do you think that how did the sort of the interest, the popular interest in space shift, or did you see it change over time as we started realizing that space was a very costly endeavor, and that perhaps sending a man to the moon doesn't have that much economic benefit apart from just saying that we can do it? So how's that changed? How has that affected your interest, your career?
Well, I think I guess a couple things. One is, I think that the space station, space shuttle does serve a very important purpose, and that is permanent life in space. That we now have humans that have been in space, with the shuttle flights regularly throughout the 80s and 90s, and then the creation of the space station in the first flying in the early 2000s, and being a permanently inhabited thing. Not only us, but other countries too. If you go back to Mir, we've had a human presence in outer space for decades now, and so I think that's important to establish, and I think it's good to acknowledge that and celebrate that as a big accomplishment. So yes, we've only been going to low Earth orbit, and that's kind of sad and disappointing that we haven't been off to Mars by now. That would be great if we had kept doing that, but you're right, it's expensive. Really expensive.
I mean,
to do the big launches.
The ISS is the most costly.
It's like $3 billion to fund every year.
Every year,
yeah.
It's $150 billion endeavor.